I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to chair this webinar, Developing Permanent Irregular Forest Structures, Lessons from Faskally Forest. One, because its subject is very close to my heart, but two, because the webinar is presented by Dr. Andrew Cameron. Andy is an old friend of mine. We were both undergraduates at Aberdeen University, and we shared similar interests and experiences in forestry and forest management at the time. So after university, we went our different ways, and we've not met for 45 years. So this is a special occasion. We find ourselves now still sharing the same interests and passion for irregular forestry. So enough reminiscing. I would now like to hand over to Andrew Cameron to make his presentation. Over to you, Andy.
Okay, thanks very much, Phil, for the introduction and reminding us just how long ago we were undergraduates. I suspect that the presentation today is a little different to the type of work that the CCFG people are involved in, because this presentation looks at the end of, or the latter stages of the transformation process. And I suspect most of you are involved in the earlier stages. So I want to look at the work that I've been involved in for almost 25 years at Faskally Forest. So if we look a little bit about the background, the transformation at Faskally was started by Professor Mark Anderson of Edinburgh University, and he established it in 1953. And he had this vision that he could create a permanent irregular forest. In fact, he visited many interesting stands in a trip to Europe. There's photographs of two of the places we know he visited, and wanted to know if we could do something similar. Just looking at where it is, Faskally Forest is in Perthshire, and the actual area is marked on the map close to Pitlochry. The area is around about 25 hectares. The original stands were conifer dominated, stands of Norway spruce, Douglas fir, European larch and Scots pine. And in 1953, the original approach to the transformation was they wanted to use the group system, 6-year cutting cycles, 60-year transformation period. So what would that be? About a tenth of the area would be felled and regenerated on a 6-year cycle. And so this idea that you would have a fixed proportion of the area cut as small dispersed gaps at each intervention. And regeneration then was by planting Douglas fir, Norway spruce, Western hemlock, European larch, and a small amount of Scots pine. However, the problem started almost straight away, and the first problem was the initial gap size of 0.02 to 0.05 of a hectare. They were just far too small. What they were finding is that the gaps were closing, the canopy was closing, and they were losing the young seedlings. They also had an issue, which I'm sure many of you experienced, with browsing damage, and of course it's very difficult to control in small dispersed groups. Fencing was clearly too expensive, and the costs of cutting and planting these small gaps became prohibitive. So an amended approach was adopted quite quickly, and they went for larger gaps to 0.05 up to 0.1 of a hectare. And the higher light levels supported the early growth of the seedlings. And of course, with fewer, bigger plots, that meant that the costs of establishment and management were a lot less. Now, there's unfortunate lack of information for quite a long period of time, from about the early 60s to the 1990s. We know a bit of work must have been done in the area, and there is a reference in the 1970s that was published in Scottish Forestry where they noted the presence of natural regeneration in these gaps. In fact, the photograph to the right of the screen is from that time. From the 1990s onwards, there was increased interest in irregular forestry, and there was far more activity taking place. The transformation area had acquired a multi-aged appearance, and I remember going to visit it in the early 1990s. And at that time, the local foresters started managing it under the single tree selection system. The current management is 6-year cutting cycles, the cutting plan based on survey plots and the diameter distribution and presence of seedlings and samplings calculated. This is quite an old figure, but I was told by Charlie Taylor approximately 120 cubic meters of timber are removed at each of the harvesting interventions. So the permanent sample plot was a 1 hectare sample plot established in 1997, and complete inventories have taken place at 6-year intervals from then until the most recent one in 2021. And the species was recorded and the DBH of all the canopy trees within the plot. Increment cores were removed for growth analysis. We'll have a look at that later. And there was assessment of natural regeneration. So what were the objectives? Well, they've changed a little bit from Anderson's time, but it's to numerically describe the development of the strand structure and the species composition during the latter stages of the transformation, and to contrast the stand metrics with data from established continental European plenter forests. We also wanted to examine the performance of a geographically diverse range of species within the site. I think I wanted to add this because to consider Mark Anderson's original vision, which I think is really still urbane today. Is it possible to create a permanent irregular forest modeled on European plenter forests? So I wanted to keep that in the background. So, assessing the advanced irregular stand, there's an expectation that irregular forests will reach a stage which after each harvesting cycle, they revert back to the same condition. And I'm sure you've read in publications the term sustainable, equilibrium, stable, balanced state. But the reality is that variation in these stands is inevitable. But I think it remains a desire that we want to achieve some degree of permanence in these stands. However, when you get to the advanced stages of irregular stand structures, it becomes much more difficult to observe changes in the stand dynamics because of increasing structural complexity. However, Kevin O'Hara suggested that these minor changes, these subtle changes in advanced irregular forest structures can be detected based on what he called his 4 sustainability criteria. And these are stand structure, stand density, growth, and species diversity. However, this will require a little bit more of investigation, and I've added this in. You need to apply mathematical methods to investigate these sustainability criteria. So measurements within the permanent sample plot, tree species and stem diameter. The canopy trees, these are all the trees greater or equal to 8 centimeters were measured. Regeneration was measured in random 2 meter square subplots within the permanent sample plot. And the seedlings and samplings They were a greater or equal to 0.1 of a meter tall and less than 8 centimeters a dBH. Basal area was measured at the center of each subplot, and that's critical because you can then measure, you can assess the basal area range, which is actually more important than the average basal area. In 2015 and 21 inventories, we split the regeneration into seedlings, which are up to 3 centimeters dBH, and what we call the saplings. They're in the 5 centimeter diameter class. In fact, all trees 3 to 7 centimeters dBH. So we can learn a little bit more about the regeneration dynamics. So measurements within the permanent sample plot, we looked at growth. Now we used a process known as transition periods, and this is the average number of years for all the trees in each diameter class to move into the next higher diameter class. And this is determined from increment cores taken from a sample of trees. Then we wanted to look at annual recruitment, and this is calculated from the transition periods. And this is the average number of trees moving from one diameter class to another. The data analysis, the first thing, we looked at the stem number diameter distribution. So we arranged the diameters into classes, the 10 centimeter class, all trees 8 to 12 centimeters dBH, 15 you can see from the information, and so forth throughout the population. We also measure the Q value. Some of you might have seen it. It's a ratio between the decline in tree number and increasing diameter, and it's calculated across the entire distribution. Now we get into a little bit more complex maths here. This is the use of Lorentz curves and Gini coefficients, and I'm not sure many of you will have come across this, but scientists have found that these processes are far more effective at analyzing stand structure. Now, Lorentz curves express tree number and diameter and basal area as proportions of the population. Now, the main thing with that is it's easier to compare stands with divergent diameter distributions, which is very common, and stands that deviate significantly from the negative exponential distribution. So we rank the trees by cumulative proportion of number of trees in the y-axis against the cumulative proportion of diameter and basal area in the x-axis. Don't worry too much, I'll show you a graph in a minute. And for completeness, this is the formula that's used to calculate that. Gini coefficients, they're very useful, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. They determine tree size diversity. What you find is very high Gini coefficients are in stands with highly imbalanced tree size distributions. Usually they're dominated by small and or very large trees. On the other hand, very low Gini coefficients, you see stands with greater homogeneity. In other words, they're moving towards the even-aged structure. Generally, irregular selection stands have comparatively higher, more stable Gini coefficients for diameter distributions and even-age stands. And for completeness, don't worry too much about it. This is the formula that's used to calculate that. Then stand density. Now, this is a measure of site occupancy. Now, usually people are familiar with number of trees per hectare stocking density or basal area per hectare, but actually a much better one is known as the stand density index. It's much more accurate in measuring site occupancy, and what it does, it's a combination of both basal area and tree number, and it has been applied in the management of irregular stands in various experimental stands around the world. And it's calculated, don't worry too much about this, calculated from the stocking density at a point when the quadratic mean stand diameter is set at an index value of 25 centimeters. Don't worry about that. And this is the formula for that. So as I say, don't be too concerned. Now moving on to growth, transition periods and annual recruitment. And this measures the growth in irregular stands. Now, transition periods is the average number of years for all the trees in each diameter class to move into the next higher class. And we determined this for the 2015 and 21 inventories using increment cores. And for completeness, I've added the equation of how this is done. Related to that is annual recruitment. Now, this is the number of trees moving from one diameter class into the next, and we use calculated from the data of the transition periods. So this is for each diameter class, you use this formula. And finally, you look at species diversity. This is estimated using what's known as the Shannon Diversity Index. And it was calculated both for the canopy trees and the understory regeneration. It's a very useful, very robust measure. It's a quantitative measure that shows how many species there are within an area or population. And for completeness, I've added the equation. Okay, I think now getting to what this all means. So what have we found over the 24 years of studying the permanent sample plot? Well, we'll start off with the stem number diameter distribution. And you can see that the 21, hope you're not colorblind, the red line, lower line, you can see that from the early days, there's been a reduction in stem numbers in the lower diameter classes since the start of the study. Interestingly, and I think if you can see the cursor, the last three inventories, the most recent three inventories, the shape of the distribution is very similar, suggesting relative stability. It's come into some form or a reasonable level of balance. And the other thing to notice is that the distributions follow what might be called as the classical negative exponential distributions that are familiar in irregular stand structures. Lorentz curves, they don't worry again too much about the underlying meaning of it, but there's the key thing is that there's been minimal change in the Lorentz curves. Again, I'm showing with a cursor in the last three inventories. Now, this supports the view that the stand structure has not changed greatly. And for basal area, and this actually is more important than the diameter, cumulative diameter, notice that, again, looking at the current line, it crosses what we call the line of equality. And what it does, it indicates that the impact of the smaller trees relative to the larger trees. So they're coming more into a balance, which again is seen as a measure of stability. Looking at the Gini coefficients here for DBH and basal area, what can we say? Well, first of all, if we look at the DBH, for the last three inventories, they're relatively stable. And I just give it a bit more information. These figures are very important because if you have high Gini coefficients greater than 0.7, this suggests you've got too many small or large trees. In fact, the latter is more usual, and that can actually be a problem. I'll mention a bit more about that later. Also, the distribution is deviating from the negative exponential distribution. However, on the other hand, small Gini coefficients, that's less than 0.3, you're seeing too few trees in the smaller classes for adequate recruitment. The stand becomes unstable. Looking at for basal area, if you look at the last two inventories, you'll find that the Gini coefficient for basal area is close to 0. And this is a cancelling effect of the smaller trees relative to the larger trees. Now, this indicates a balance in the proportion of stand basal area between the small and large trees in the population. And this is a strong indicator of relatively balanced structure at Faskally is developing. I just want to add this. One of the problems that certainly in sites that I've seen is that people are reluctant to cut the larger trees down, and this is often a problem because if you get too many large trees, you impede the future regeneration and recruitment. So don't worry, a lot of data here, but I will take you through it. This is the canopy structure based on the number of trees per hectare over the 5 inventories. So the key features will start, I've highlighted here. Now, there was an early decision when the project started that there wasn't enough regeneration and that the stocking density of the canopy trees had to be reduced. In fact, you can see over the 5 inventories, it's nearly halved. And in that time, basal area, average basal area, I should point out, has come down quite substantially as well. And this is because we needed more regeneration and recruitment. We'll look at that in a minute. The second thing to look at is a decline in the Q value. And in fact, over the last 3 inventories, the Q value has remained constant and suggests again that there's a relative stability in the stand over this period. Okay, looking at growth and recruitment, looking at the number of seedlings and saplings per hectare, and you'll notice for the 2015 and 21 they've been split. So the key factors here, if we look at the bottom line, I hope it comes up on your screens, you can see that the number of seedlings and saplings has greatly increased since 1997. And in fact, that was the purpose of reducing the canopy stocking density. If you look at the intermediate and shade tolerating species, well, they're dominating the regeneration and recruitment into the canopy. If you look at the light demanding species, there are few, if any, seedlings and saplings in light demanding, for example, the larch and pine. And if you look at the light demanding birch, it takes advantage of new openings, but it doesn't have the advantage, and eventually they succumb, and very few move into the sapling stage. Also, I want to look just a little bit more closely at the number of saplings. That's in the 5 centimeter diameter class. And I split them into shade and semi-shade tolerating conifers and broadleaves, and then light demanding conifers and broadleaves in the red and orange. And it's pretty clear that the shade tolerating species are dominating future recruitment into the canopy. So moving on to growth, this is determined by transition periods and annual recruitment. What have we found here? Well, if we look at the left boxes in the table, the average transition periods, they're lower for shade tolerating species in both 2015 and 2021. And this indicates a higher average growth rate than for light demanding species. If you look at the average annual recruitment, this is trees per hectare per year, they're much higher for the shade tolerating species compared with light demanding species. And this is the reason why on this graph, what you find is that you get a increased growth of shade tolerating species with increasing tree size, whereas the opposite is true with the light demanding species. And the reason is the seedlings and saplings are developing within a partially shaded understory. Therefore, recruitment into the canopy, the trees get greater light, allowing the crowns to expand and increase in growth. And this is what's putting pressure on the light demanding species for space and light. In fact, the light demanding species are losing out. Finally, looking at the species diversity, the canopy trees has been more or less a consistent increase in species over the time. There's been a slight decline in the understory species. This is due to the point I was making that the light demanding species are being eliminated. However, if you look at the average since 1997, the species diversity, now this is all through natural regeneration, has doubled over the period of the study. So how does our experimental stand, compare with continental plenter stands? Well, let's just have a comparison. So I'm only using some examples because I don't have space for putting them all in. But generally, if you start off with the Q value, that many reports show that the Q value in Central European plenter forests is between 1.3 and 1.6. For Faskally, it's 1.4. So we're right in the zone there. And what about stand density and stand density index? Well, there are some publications. This is one from a fir beech plenter forest in Slovenia. So that's 345 stems per hectare in the density, and the stand density index of 504. Faskally, well, we're not too far out there either. We're quite close with these measures. What about mean basal area and range? Well, there's a lot of publications around this. I've only given some examples. For example, 27 square meters per hectare suggested as the maximum basal area for regeneration of intermediate and shade tolerant species. 24 is suggested for successful recruitment of semi-shade tolerant species, for example, like Douglas fir and Sitka spruce. 25, the maximum suggested for a basal area of beech dominated selection stands. Now remember, beech needs a big canopy and it needs more space. So what about Faskally? Well, we're in this, sorry, there's one more, the range. Sorry, I forgot about this. The range for a managed spruce and fir, and this is important. This is more important than the average, 15 to 35. You've got a large range of microclimates in these forests. And then going back to what's at Faskally, well, our mean basal area is 24, which is more or less, matches what we found elsewhere. And the basal area range also is very, very close. I did point out there was an outlier in a very thick place that the student measured, but you can see again that the metrics fit very closely with a range of other stands in other countries. Back to the Gini coefficients. Again, I've just given you some examples here. You can see kind of more or less from 0.4 to 0.7. Some are narrower depending on where the measurements were made. So what about Faskally? Well, we're right in the middle, 0.54. So another sign that the balance of the structure is very similar to the plenter forests. Rate of recruitment for shade tolerant and light demanding species. Again, there's quite a bit been published on this, but this is a good example from a spruce fir beech forest. 5.83 for the shade tolerant, 0.13 for the light demanding. Remember, I was saying from the graph earlier, they're really struggling. What about Faskally? Well, not bad. Pretty close. We're seeing the same pattern and difference in recruitment between shade tolerant and the light demanding species. And what about average recruitment into the lowest canopy diameter class. Now, this is important. And again, I've just given you some examples here. I've given you two from European spruce fir, beech, plenter forests, and two from the boreal region, irregular coniferous forest. And you can see the numbers there. Well, if you look at Faskally, we're right in the middle, absolutely right in the middle of that. Now, this is an important measure, the minimum number of trees in the smallest canopy class. Now, this is seen as critical to maintain the irregular structure, and it's one that's often cited by people who manage plenter structures. And I've just given you, again, a couple of examples from the literature. 115 to 120 trees recruited into the smallest, should be in the smallest class to maintain the distribution. That's in the Central European plenter forests, and 90 to 120 in a separate study. So where does Faskally fit in this? Well, again, we're absolutely, you know, in the zone, very similar. So in conclusion, I think first of all, it's worth putting a warning here that this is a very rare, indeed unique experimental site, and so I would sound caution in wider dissemination of the findings because it is one site, but it is really interesting how similar in terms of the metrics that we found at Faskally Forest. And remember, it's comprising a mix of European and North American species with Central European spruce, fir, beech, plenter forests. And I think it demonstrates that a range of species from North America and Europe and possibly elsewhere can coexist within managed selection stands. And this suggests that the silvicultural characteristics of the species are much more important than their geographic origin. But has the stand reached a balanced condition? Well, I've said yes, but accepting that there inevitably will be variations over time in stand structure, and these are inevitable. And just to finish off, make sure, you know, to make sure that you get this point, nothing in nature is static, and studies in long-term Central European plenter forests have found a lot of variation in structure over a lot longer period than the Faskally study, some going back over 100 years. In fact, forests are constantly changing, and this is important to emphasize. I should have underlined it. There's no ideal single structure. And for this reason, a warning, mathematically smoothed stem number diameter curves should not be used as target steady state distribution. So you can get a mathematically perfect negative exponential distribution and then you obliterate the bits above and below it. You should not do that. You could actually lose the structure by following that. Instead, you must consider a range of stand characteristics within the broader plenter structure, and that it can be sustained in a long time. And so just to finish, the key to success: continuous adequate levels of regeneration and recruitment, absolutely vital. Managing the stand structural characteristics within the silvicultural range of the species. And if you achieve that, you will achieve the third one, and that's maintain the negative exponential diameter distribution. So just to thank the staff at Tay Forest District. They've been absolutely incredible over the years, allowing the university to carry out this long-term study, and I want to compliment them on the excellent management of the area. And I've just got 2 pages, if those who want some bedtime reading, of the publications I've used. And that finishes the presentation. So I do stop share. Okay.
Are you able to share your screen, Phil?
I'm afraid I've lost everything. I can hear you, Polly. I've unmuted and I clicked, but I've lost it.
We can hear you. I'm going to try and find you on and see if I can ask you to share again.
Okay.
Phil Morgan. Asked to start video. Try that.
I can see things. Start my video. There you are. There we are.
I can see you. Yes.
Right. There we are. I don't know. Maybe I pressed the wrong button.
And just to say, I'm delighted to say there have been nearly 80 people watching, and most of them are still here. So go ahead with the questions. That's wonderful.
Okay. Yes, that's right. There have been a few questions. The questions have not been pouring in, so you still have plenty of time. I'm going to be reading out the questions to Andrew, but if you have any thoughts or have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I shall read them out. Well, first of all, thank you, Andrew, for that absolutely fascinating presentation. It was really jam-packed with an awful lot of information, lots and lots of interesting things, lots of very useful indicators that you've been developing and using, and a massive amount of really good work over a very long time. So it's very, very impressive. You know, I have visited Faskally in 2016, and it really is a unique example of transformation to continuous cover, because it goes back such a long way, and a lot of the things that you've been exploring and that the points that you've made in your presentation, I think, are going to be very, very useful to a lot of people. And it also contrasts with different approaches. You know, you've had a particular approach; it's been an experimental one, and you have been monitoring, you know, the progress of the forest. And it really is interesting to see that you have all these indicators, whether they be Q values or stand density index, and you know the Lorenz curves and the different inventories over the years, you can demonstrate that you are very close to structural achievement. So it must be one of the rare examples of an irregular stand which is close to equilibrium, so the so-called equilibrium. But what it really is, it's structural achievement. You've been through this phase of regeneration that you described very nicely, and structural development, but you're now at a stage where you are approaching equilibrium. So that is really, really interesting, because there are there are other good examples of continuous cover in Britain, but few of them are at that stage of development. So it's a very, very, very interesting example, and it's fantastic that you've been able to do so much work there to demonstrate so clearly what you have. It really is fascinating. So thank you for that. I will, yeah. And also the notes of caution and things like that. I think that's very, very useful. You know, the great Zing saying not to follow the mathematical models. And there's a Swiss, you know, who is used to la méthode du contrôle, where they counted every tree, and they actually, you know, manufactured the reverse J curve, saying not the opposite, but saying be careful. You know, don't attempt to do that. So lots of very, very useful things. So I think I'm going to turn to these questions now, so that there's more questions coming in. This is excellent. So let me see. Yes, this is a question. This is the first question we had. Yeah, this is from John. Given the probable rising temperatures and probable more frequent and more intense droughts, also runoff of acid from conifers into rivers, is there an argument for gradual blocking of drains from when trees are well established? Blocking need not be continuous, a little every 20 meters perhaps, and initially not every drain in a row. So is this somebody saying that we don't want to be changing the sites, that, you know, our forests can be adaptive, and maybe blocking water, blocking drains, control, holding the flow. Is this something that we could think about?
Well, it's perhaps a little bit out of this highly intense experiment that on one site that I've looked at. But remember that once a forest canopy is established, it effectively removes a lot of the excess water. You'll see it with even-aged stands as well. And remember, we're looking at permanence here. So you've got a high above ground biomass in an irregular stand structure and a relatively high transpiration rate. So I don't really think that the drainage on the site, once you've achieved structural diversity, will be a big issue.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Andrew. That's very helpful. Here's another question. How have you managed to control browsing damage to regeneration? You've got some very good pictures of regeneration there and some well-developed structures. Do you do any at all? I'm based in Southeast England, and this is from Barney Price. I'm based in Southeast England, looking to develop several monoculture stands to an irregular system, and deer browsing is proving to be the most significant factor militating against this effort.
Well, yes, I couldn't agree more. Browsing damage is one of the most difficult things to deal with. Fortunately, Faskally is a very popular tourist area and it's widely visited, which tends to scare the deer away. But the Forest District do control the deer numbers. We have recorded browsing damage. I couldn't put all the data into this presentation or I'd be here for another half hour. But there are quite high losses, which I've mentioned. I've recently published a paper on this in forestry, and you do lose a lot. If you remember the figures that I showed for the seedlings and then the saplings, there's a big loss, but all plenter stands have the same problem throughout Europe, and that's why you need enough trees. You need a lot of seedlings, and some of them will survive and grow to get that critical number being recruited into the canopy. And that's why, if you saw the figures, you've got thousands and thousands of seedlings per hectare, but only a small number of them will eventually make it.
Well, yeah, that's right. I will agree with that. That this is one of the benefits of continuous cover, that you have this vast amount of regeneration. The person who asked the question does have a point. There are places in Europe where they cannot practice continuous cover without a deer fence.
Yes,
there are parts of England as well, similar to that, and Ireland. Deer control is very, very important, particularly if you want the species diversity, I would say. But yeah, here's another question, Andrew. This is interesting. Do the shade-tolerant, intolerant recruitment ratios vary with latitude as the sunlight changes angles?
Well, I presented some data from Scandinavia and Central European forests, and it doesn't seem to make any difference in terms of proportion. It's very similar.
Yeah, I think this is something that Rodney Helliwell looked at, and he felt that the sunlight angle did not make any great difference to the success of different species. So another one, did the stand experience much damage from recent storm events?
One or two trees came down, but no is the answer to that. In 2014, there was a storm which flattened surrounding even age stands. Only 14 trees were blown down within the permanent sample plot. And interestingly, it spanned the range of diameters. It wasn't the big trees, all the big trees as you might expect. It was a kind of random sample, but 14 trees felling made no difference to the structure of the stand. And so I've written this in an earlier paper, that this is another bit of evidence that irregular forests are more wind firm than even age stands.
Yeah, I support that, and the tree architecture and the root architecture are very, very different in an irregular stand. And the other point as well is that because you have a structure there, and we're talking about this excess numbers of regeneration, and you have that complexity, so that if you do have a certain amount of wind blow and the stand is decapitalized, you can build that back very, very, very quickly, because you have all those recruits that are just ready to respond, and
exactly
being lost. Yeah. So fascinating. Okay, thank you for that. Yes, this is from Chris. You mentioned 120 meter cubed of timber removed. Yeah. That surprised me, actually. 120 meter cube per intervention. What time frame and what area was this over?
Well, this is information I got from the Forest District, so I wasn't involved in this, but I asked Charlie Taylor, approximately how much they get out per hectare through the transformation area, and that was the figure I got. It is a few years old, it may have changed, but I unfortunately, and I can understand the Forest District, I did ask them on more than one occasions if they would measure all the trees coming out, the species, size and volume, but they said they couldn't do it because of the amount of work, and they had contractors in, and I'm sure a lot of you as practitioners will know exactly what that's like. So unfortunately, I don't have detailed information on production.
I recall a conversation that when Pro Silver visited Faskally in 2016 with Charlie Taylor, and he was saying that that they had fairly the cycle between interventions was quite a long one, that they didn't go in on every 4 or 5 years. They went in, I think, 6 or 7 years apart.
Yes.
And that accounted for the 120 meters. So they went in hard, whereas a continuous cover forester might like to go in a little more gently and more often on a shorter cycle.
Yeah, I should point out, Phil, that in the earlier stages, more volume was taken out, as you could pick up from the figures I had, when we had to reduce the canopy to encourage more regeneration. But it has balanced out. But as I say, I don't have up-to-date figures on the timber output. I mean, my study is on the stand dynamics. And that's where I've put the effort in. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and here's an interesting question again from David White. And what's the future of the experiment?
Well, I'll be retiring probably in a year's time, and I don't know is the answer to that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's a bit worrying. Okay. John Burgess asks, which single measure do you think is the easiest and or best to use to practice, and which would you recommend?
Now, I disagree. There's no single measure. That's the whole point. I know everyone looks for a quick fix, something that can go out, easy to do, but you have to look at a range of measures. You have to look at the silviculture, you have to look at the regeneration, you have to look at the level of recruitment, all the points that I've been making. And in fact, it's not me that's making this. Way back in the early part of the last century, Henri Bioli said exactly the same. And not too look at one thing, and that you have to take a holistic view of the stand.
Mm. Yes, yeah, and you know, as you say, that you know, you're going to have species mixtures that are going to vary over time, that also going to vary from place to place, you know, because they're going to be adapted with differences in site, you know, microsite types and these sort of things. So all these things are going to affect it, and this is why you rely on mensuration. In fact, so that you're following the progress of these stands. You're seeing whether the regeneration is moving from class to class and into poles and into trees, and you're monitoring the species diversity at the same time. And so you know, the basal area is going to vary for all those different situations. And you know, the basal area is the one that I would be guided mainly by, but you know, these other indicators that you have, you know, the Q value, the stability of the Q value is a very, very good thing. That I think that depends
I agree.
on multiple inventories, but you know, and that's demonstrating, you know, how close you are to equilibrium. But to answer the question, I would say the basal area really is the one that you really want to be guided by initially.
Yeah, I mean, I would just step back one, and you really need to look at the regeneration, and you'll have to do a count, an assessment of that, and then refer it to the basal area, stand basal area, but more this basal area range. Now, if you're getting sufficient regeneration, then the basal area is probably, but you know, close to what you would want. But so rather than just sort of picking a figure out of a book and say, I'm going to apply, you know, thin it down to a certain basal area, it doesn't work like that. You know, you've got to take the regeneration into account, and recruitment, and the number of old trees. This is something people are reluctant to often cut more of the bigger trees, and that's important to maintain the structure.
This is a fascinating conversation, I think, because you know, old trees have big trees have an effect on the stand, and if you have a larger final tree size, you can have a higher basal area, but then that is a more advanced stage of transformation, and big trees provide a very, very useful engine. You know, they produce wood very, very efficiently, and they control structure in a very important way as well. So big tree is really important, especially if you're looking at modeling transformations and things like that. And now, you know, your final tree size determines how much basal area you can have, and a whole load of different things as well. But you know, these models are all very well, but they're for single species, and irregular stands are much more complex than that. They've got all sorts of different species and all those species interactions, and therefore, you know, you need to be modeling rather than looking too carefully at just one thing all the time.
Absolutely, yes.
So Philip Gordon has asked, Faskally is perhaps unusual in being a relatively small area, but with a much larger forested landscape with high public access. Have these factors hindered or helped in the transformation and management?
Well, perhaps that should be better directed to the forest staff who actually manage the site. I see messages, I think it's that Charlie Taylor, and that he's been managing it for a long time, and you know, done a fantastic job. I mean, they really have been excellent in allowing us to monitor it. So really, the role that university has had is to gather data and try and work out the processes, the dynamics in the later stages, and how that relates to long established plenter forests in continental Europe, which of course was the original vision of Mark Anderson.
Yes. Thanks, Andrew. John Lees, what are the longer term thoughts in terms of shade-tolerant species stand dominance in a small stand area?
Well, I don't see any problem. And I mean, this is exactly what you find in plenter forests, long-established plenter forests in Europe, they benefit shade tolerance, and species that are adapted to tolerating shade, certainly during the early stages of growth, inevitably will dominate the stand. But what's interesting is the number of species that have come in from outside and regenerated over the period that I've been involved in it is really quite interesting. As every year you find something new, every inventory you find something new. It's survival, but irregular stand structures inevitably will favor shade tolerance, and you have to accept that.
Yeah. Okay, there's one question here from Ian Sterling, who's asking about management techniques and also felling techniques, ground prep for planting, encouraging regen. Charlie has very kindly responded and said it's manual felling and forwarder extraction and no ground prep. Okay, thank you, Charlie.
Thanks,
okay.
Charlie. Yes.
That's right. Andy isn't qualified to reply to that one. Very interesting. This is from Jacob Dean. Very interesting and in-depth research, which it would be unlikely to replicate in the private sector. Given this, what are the key indicators which we could monitor to understand progression towards the same outcome?
Well, that's a good question. Now, first of all, this is an academic study, and I wouldn't expect practitioners to do the type of work that I've presented here. The whole idea was to demonstrate and objectively, empirically, that we can create stable irregular plenter structures in this country from a mix of species, native, non-native, well, mainly non-native, European and North American. But I think the point that to answer the second part of the question there, the points that you made, Phil, earlier is looking at basal area, looking at regeneration, and I mean, the early history of Faskally is quite interesting, because they made a mess of it at the start, and for the reasons I've mentioned, and they then started cutting bigger gaps. Now that's something that's got to be done. If you're looking at up to 0.1 of a hectare, you're looking at fairly big gaps. But I wrote a paper recently in Scottish Forestry about transforming Sitka spruce. And I mean, my view is that you've got to start this early. Certainly, not much later than the time of first thinning, to develop stability and thinning. But I think you need to cut gaps then. And I suggested in my paper that I would cut 20% of the space as gaps and plant them up. Now, a lot of the trees, in even age 20-year-old, 25-year-old, are probably not producing very much seed. So plant them up, and you can add new species in. The important thing, and this is again in the literature from people who've been doing this for a long, long time, is to get the diverse structure. That's the key. You've got to get the diverse structure, and once you've got that, then the rest of it follows much more readily. But I would suggest, cutting gaps, looking at basal area, which is easy to do. Make sure that the stands are stabilized through careful thinning. Choose the right sites as well. You're always going to take a risk. And the thing is, you're opening stands up much more than you would under even age silviculture. If you're going to cut holes in the canopy, you are taking risks. But unless you take risks, you're not going to get anywhere. So choose your sites very, very carefully.
Thanks, Andrew. I would concur with all of that. That is very, very, very interesting. I'm looking at the time now. Our time is up. There are some other questions there, but I think we need to wrap this up now, because our time is up. Everybody can see, will be able to see the questions. But there's some more questions about wind damage, and people also, Ted Wilson has asked you some rather technical questions about the Gini index and things like that. So we won't go there just now. But I would just like to support that last reply there that you made, Andrew, that, you know, creating these gaps early on needs to be done. And we've developed a system in Wales that we call the graduated density thinning, so that we go in and we do thinnings early on, and these gaps are created not in a designed way but in an adaptive way, so that you have a thinning pattern and you have selection criteria, and if you remove all the poorest quality trees, you will find you've created holes in the canopy. And the graduated density also gives you it's a 1 in 8, which is then middle row taken out after the second intervention, so 1 in 8 going to a 1 in 4. Because you have this time lag, you have difference in crown heights as well. So you have these mechanisms where you can manage the risk, as you say, but also initiate a bit of structural diversity there on a vertical as well as on a horizontal basis as well. And that enrichment planting, because if you're in a young stand of Sitka spruce, there will be only one species there. You have to put in some enrichment planting to get the species diversity, and also to get ahead of the Sitka regeneration, because when it comes, it comes. And you need the western red cedars and the Douglas firs and the other things in there with it. Right. Okay. So I'd like to thank you, Andrew, for this, because it's been an absolutely stunning presentation. Thank you for that. Masses and masses of very, very good information. And as you say, this is not an experiment in how to manage the woodlands. This is simply a record of a forest. And you said, there was a choppy history there, and things have changed. But this is a unique example of a stand of mixed conifers, North American exotics mixed in with native species as well, and so lots and lots of different things to look at there. But it demonstrates that stands of irregular stands can reach advanced transformations in this country, and that the structural achievement is there in Faskally. It's a really remarkable thing, and it's really an inspiration to anybody who is practicing CCF to see that you have these results.
Thanks very much. Yes, that's great.
Well, thank you, Andrew, but I'd like to thank everybody else for attending, and Polly for having set this up, and Bill Mason as well, for having asked me to chair this meeting. Right, so goodbye to everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Goodbye.